second session on advances and challenges in land change modeling. In this session, we have three full talks and 3 flash talks. So we'll have plenty of time after the presentations to ask additional questions to the presenters, or have a general discussion among ourselves regarding what has been presented today, or further advances, talking about advances and what other challenges there may be in regards to land change modeling. So our first presenter is Oliver Perkins, and his is a full talk. So.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name's Ol. So we're going to be talking about efforts to represent humans in the UK Earth system model, so the terrestrial components of that. So this talk is covering content in these 2 papers. And this is a kind of team effort of people across disciplines. So us land use modelers in the middle, some physicists, and some anthropologists all working together to make it happen. So this work began after the first fire model into comparison project, which is part of ISIMIP, the intersectional model into comparison project, if you know that. And basically the findings that came out of that led the physicists to ask for our help. So basically what they found was that lack of representation of human dimensions of fire were a big limitation in the models. So both between the models themselves and between models and observations. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a sensitivity experiment where they basically held population and land cover constant at 1750, and then you've got the difference from the kind of baseline model run. So if you look at population in the middle, you've got some models thinking that would increase fire, you've got some models thinking it would decrease it, no agreement on trend or magnitude of the signal, same with land cover. And basically the underlying reason for this is the way that our dynamic global vegetation models, the terrestrial bits of Earth system models, try and incorporate human dimensions of fire with these very simplistic functions of population density, right? So it's just a kind of a global analytic function of population density saying how many fires you think there will be. So they brought us on board to try and improve this and to try and build in a more granular representation of humans in these models. And so we're land system modelers, and yes, really interested in fire. Fire's really fascinating, but also what we're trying now to do is build this into a more generalizable platform for human Earth system modeling in the UK ESM. So we began by kind of trying to find a framework to think about how humans use and manage fire globally, and the kind of interactions between those things, between different land systems, forestry, livestock farming, cropland, and so forth, and sort of basically kind of patterns of economic development. And we drew on the Malek typology, which has sort of 6 basic empirically defined types: subsistence-oriented smallholder, survivalist, market-oriented smallholder, this kind of thing. And then we kind of cross-reference this with different land system types. And I think one of the really important things when you're thinking about fire modeling is to think about non-extractive land management. So basically things like the US Forestry Service, how do they manage land that's not economically productive? Do they go with kind of fire suppression, or do they have a more fire inclusive, biodiverse mindset to the land management? So we took that kind of framework and we used it to develop a literature meta-analysis. So during COVID, we had the joy of reading 500 or more papers and putting all the data in a database. And basically what we find is that human fire use, human fire interactions differ consistently and in spatially predictable ways around the world. And that these different ways, different reasons for humans using fire to manage the land have different quantitative signals in the resulting fire. So for example, here you've got what we call crop field preparation, which is basically shifting cultivation, has a kind of small median fire size with a kind of 14% mean burned area. And that differs quite substantially to something like pasture management, so pasture burning to renew the pasture, which has a larger fire size and tends to have a larger percentage of the land burned per year. So we took this database and we used it to build a model called WHAM, which stands for Wildfire Human Agency Model, which is sort of draws on agent-based approaches at the global scale. So it's trying to represent from a kind of behavioral perspective human decision-making around fire. And it sort of represents the distribution of different, what we call agent functional types, so sort of different systems of land use, very simply, and it represents the kind of competition for land between them, empirically and quite simply. So here you've got one example of a decision tree for the shifting cultivation, or SWIDDEN, agent functional type, and we basically use the data in our database to build the classifier, and we then bootstrapped the thresholds to give them a kind of numeric distribution, and then we just sum them and divide by the total to give you a kind of pixel fraction of each agent functional type. And you can see the outputs on the right hand side with these uncertainties coming from the bootstrap numerical distributions. So how did we plug this into Joule's Inferno, which is the fire and vegetation bits of the UK Earth system model? Well, basically on the top left, you can see how it worked before we got involved, which is that all fires are treated as similar events. And so whether it's a kind of lightning strike in the middle of the boreal forest or a kind of small agricultural burn somewhere in the tropics, they're treating them the same. And so now we're treating these as categorically discrete, different events. And so we're representing these human fire use decisions. How controlled is the fire use? And basically, if there's a controlled, managed fire, we calculate the data within our model. And if it's an uncontrolled fire, turns into a free-burning wildfire, we then pass that to the biophysical model, which then calculates the fire spread according to biophysical factors. And then you can see on the right-hand side how this all kind of fits together to build a kind of coupled human and natural systems view of fire on Earth. So I'm really hesitant to say this is good. It's better using the metrics that were used in the first fire model into comparison project. So yeah, you can see on the left-hand side, we did a comparison with Inferno, the fire module, without inclusion of our model and with it. And so you can see the correlation increases with satellite product significantly and substantially. And we also do a better job of getting the magnitude of fire right. So a lot of fire on Earth is kind of small human fires. And as the satellite products are improving, we now detect more of them. And so we're doing a better job of capturing that distribution in our model. So what do we learn from doing this? Well, one of the big challenges in fire modeling has been a failure to capture interannual variability and extreme fire events, which can be like orders of magnitude greater than the kind of mean or median of the distribution. And one of the reasons I think for this is that if you treat all fires as similar events and think they all have the same biophysical spread drivers, then what you end up doing is applying a load of fudge factors, because the things that are driving fire spreads in agricultural fires in the tropics are very different to the drivers of wildfire spread. And so by pulling these apart, what you can actually do is start to increase the sensitivity of those fires that are free-burning wildfires to their biophysical drivers. And so we think, we're working on this now, we think we can start to improve the model's capacity to represent extreme events. Yeah, so another big question in fire science has been declining burned area in the tropics. And so, yeah, pulling apart these signals again seems to do quite a nice job of explaining this, and we can now reproduce declining burned area in the satellite products. And we can show that it's a function basically of landscape fragmentation, and you've got this very wide correlation with the flammability of vegetation. And then kind of in areas where you've got a large decline in fire, you've got these factors such as cropland conversion and road density, expansion playing a bigger role in driving declining burned area. Yeah, so something that we're now working on as we're trying to generalize this is incorporating livestock density and livestock fuel consumption. So basically, you can see on the bottom left how we've done this, and so this is showing kind of the proportion of the biomass that's consumed by livestock. This is again using our agent-based methods to sort of simulate this from the bottom up. And then you can see on the right-hand side, basically, that using this and using our representation of pasture management fires and fuel consumption from livestock, you can see the kind of impact that has overall on Bern's area. And fundamentally, what's happening here is you've got an increase in fire in sub-Saharan Africa and a big dampening of the signal elsewhere. And so what has happened is that physical fire models have fit their physics to a signal that shows a lot of fire in sub-Saharan Africa and not much elsewhere or less elsewhere. And we think basically what we've done is underfit the biophysical niche of fire. So without livestock farming and this suppressive effect, there would be a lot more fire elsewhere. And we think this is one of the reasons why fire models have not shown the observed increase in fire in the boreal forests that has recently been occurring, because we've kind of underfit its niche to observations, and we're not accounting for this widespread human dampening signal outside of sub-Saharan Africa. So we've started looking at nitrogen as well. So our model seems to show useful things about syndromes of nitrogen overconsumption or nitrogen overuse. So here you've got our market-oriented smallholder, agent functional type. You've got the kind of yield gap on the x-axis and nitrogen use on the y. So you've got very intensive nitrogen use with large yield gaps remaining, so kind of quite inefficient nitrogen use. And we seem to be doing an okay job of beginning to reproduce patterns of observed fertilizer use. So time's up. I'll leave those conclusions there. Thanks.
Can take a couple of questions. Thank you, Oliver. Our second presenter is Abhijit Parmar, and he will talk about forest landscapes in India.
To present or talk about today is something which I've been resonating across the theme of this event. We have also seen like different concerns and different advancement in methods, different priorities which have been like related to the forest landscape restoration. So our effort here is basically to do two things. First, to identify basically the locations which are to be prioritized, and I will come upon that topic later. And also in the second aspect, that what are the different ways in which the prioritization basically can result into multiple benefits. So I want to take a step back and just to consider the scholarship in terms of the forest landscape restoration, which is not like new now. There have been like exhaustive global effort basically to map out the areas which are like which has to be prioritized, which has restoration potential with different kind of restoration objectives. It's like biodiversity richness or like food production, and means you understand. So what we wanted to basically focus on is that how basically we can put livelihood to the debate of the restoration, because the question of livelihood is something which is going to be very much important. With increasing population, you have like question of food security, livelihood, employment, and in achieving these kind of objectives, you interact with the ecosystem, and then there is a production of a very hybrid kind of ecosystem. So what we wanted to do that, can we basically talk about the lost ecological function of the human being or the people, and how we can put people and livelihood in the debate of the restoration. So in doing so, you can see this particular map which have been produced in 2020, which basically estimates the number of forest proximate people which live within 5 kilometers of the forest areas in the world. So according to the 2012 estimate, the number itself was 1.6 billion. And according to previous studies in terms of the potential restoration, we have 2 billion hectares which are to be restored. So what you see here in the italics is something which we are doing, some of which are of course part of the wish list, and some things that we have basically achieved. So the idea is basically to build a kind of tool. Means there are like research which have produced restoration potential and objectives at 300 meter, at 1 kilometer. But when, as a practitioner, when I go to the ground, I really find it very difficult that how basically the restoration planning has to happen. So can we basically bring down a very high resolution, reliable like tool on the ground in the hand of the practitioners, implementation agencies or the policy makers, so that they can basically use this particular framework to prioritize like pixels or land at very high resolution, where you can basically do the restoration activity with with the objectives that you basically choose according to your preferences, according to the investment available, and then basically get to a restoration outcome. So idea is to build a framework, build a tool, and also make it accessible to the people, where the conversational interface basically comes into the picture. So means with these large language models now it's become possible basically to you can query the spatial database in a kind of very interactive fashion. So that is also part of our intervention. So the first thing that we wanted to achieve is to basically bring down the resolution to a very like high level. So we basically started analysis with the 30 meter resolution. So the unit of analysis in our research is the ecoregions, terrestrial ecoregions of the world. So out of 876, we selected 741 ecoregions for which we have individually trained the models. So by taking the covariates and also the historical transitions, we basically trained 741 different random forest or decision tree model to basically generate the outcome. So here are the quick snapshot. So these are the steps which basically we used to study the historical transition. So we used GLC FCS 30D product, which is a yearly land cover change product. And we studied that what are the different pathways of transition, where means in past there was a forest which transitioned to a non-forest cover and then again became forest. So these are the pathways which are basically historical pathways which we took into account and extracted covariates which have influenced this particular transition. So by combining these pathways and the covariates, the model was trained basically to generate which particular pixels will have high probability of getting restored in the future. We also, since the data volume was too high, we also basically reverted on a kind of deep learning model. So we also trained a LSTM model basically to see that what is the enhancement in terms of the accuracy. So a spatial random forest and the LSTM model basically generated multiple different kind of prediction accuracy. So we again went back to the covariates, that which particular covariates are basically contributing in terms of affecting the accuracy of the model. So idea was not to basically produce a complex model, but to produce a model which is explainable, which can be easily like tweaked, and which can basically act as a generalized framework when new variables needs to be added. So these are the like historical pathways that you can see. This is the snapshot of the entire process. So first we studied the historical transition. We basically took into account the multiple like these change products, which one of which is glance, and we also basically trained, means used a land rendered best change detection model to generate our own outcome. So out of these three like methods, where pixels which have basically produced the same kind of level using these three methods were taken as a training sample. Then we extracted the covariates and then trained two different models. One is, of course, the spatial random forest, and other is the LSTM, to generate the prediction map. Then comes the question of prioritization, that which particular like method basically we can use for prioritization. So the choice was, of course, a decision tree, which is computationally robust, flexible, and so we basically improved the architecture and shifted to a object-oriented, like a Bayesian network, because several covariates will be impacting one another. So in terms of basically like producing a general framework of prioritization, so that was the choice of the model, and this is the prioritization that we did in terms of the security of the tenure in Indian landscape, where the titles are basically secured with the local communities. So, and there could be like multiple like objectives. So idea is basically to design a framework where at a very high resolution, where people can basically input their like variable of choice and then get these kind of prioritized restoration maps at high resolution. So that is, it's a live research and a live tool which can keep on evolving depending upon the advancement in terms of the methods, in terms of availability of data, and also in terms of the variability of the outcome when it comes to the implementation. Because at a village scale, priorities might be different. At a regional scale, priorities might be different. So the question of variability is very critical, and also the question of livelihood is basically critical. So how basically we can put these two things into a kind of in center, that was the key intent of the this project. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Sorry that I asked it, but I might have overheard it. Could you elaborate a bit more how you come with prioritization? What are the major, let's say, content-wise factors, how you define it? As probably just elaborate a bit more what is.
So prioritization basically refers to like what are the different objectives. So as a planner, basically, where I can suppose my objective is to get the carbon credits, or my objective is to basically achieve biodiversity richness in a particular area. So that is what we mean by prioritization. So we have a base like map, which basically says that a particular pixel has a highest probability to be restored in the future. Now you take that pixel, and depending upon your objectives, we basically feed into a decision tree. So based upon the different weights of the node, the pixels in that particular region are basically prioritized. That whether this particular pixel has highest priority of getting a kind of restoration and simultaneously biodiversity richness, or a particular pixel has a kind of potential to get restoration and carbon richness. The improvement that we basically made here is basically to build a kind of Bayesian network framework, where basically means connected nodes are basically affected by one another. So if you are basically prioritizing certain objectives, then you can also dynamically see that what other parameters are basically getting compromised. So a kind of clear quantification of the trade-offs that can be basically extracted from this particular framework. So yeah.
Last full presentation will be given by Michal Svitelski.
Hello everyone, my name is Michał Switalski. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Group for Planning of Landscapes and Urban System at the ETH in Zurich, and today I'll be talking about modeling place instead of space for the urban-rural gradient. As we all know, urbanization is increasing, whereas the protection of natural areas is decreasing. To quote from the United Nations Sustainability Report, by 2030 we are projected to have 43 megacities, that is cities with populations above 10 million people. However, most urban populations will not be living in these megacities. They will be living in fringe areas or peri-urban areas with less access to the infrastructures of such megacities. In addition to the natural impacts of urbanization that we're all aware of, there's also cultural impacts. And one way of understanding these cultural impacts is through our experience of space, which can be described as place. And by places we can think of local spaces which have been shaped across time according to the local specificities of the environment and the people, or without any local specificities, shaped to be more and more increasingly homogeneous. So we find ourselves entangled in a feedback loop where global homogenization processes detach people from the environments that they live in, which further makes them more fragile to system shocks and disconnect them even further from the population which live there. So my talk will be today about this feedback loop and how to reverse it. In more detail, I will be talking briefly about the theory of place and place making. And in particular, we'll be talking about modeling and measuring place. So place making is the process behind generating or changing places. This includes large sweeping changes, such as land use change that we are all aware of, as well as more localized initiatives. We can understand placemaking as an emergent process of people interacting individually as well as a collective through procedures and acting on a variety of places. For those who are less familiar with place studies as a field, you can think of placemaking as very localized transformation pathways as you see here, where practical levers correspond to places, political to procedures, and people to the personal attitudes. As part of the ERC Globescape project, we could delve into these three areas. Today I will be focusing on measuring place. So place is physical space as experienced as a person. Here we see the overview of the place concept of the 20th century. On one side we have environmental determinism, which posits that the physical space is primary in shaping our experience of place. On the other hand, we have our experience of place, so social constructivism, which posits that our experience of place is primary in shaping places. In the middle we can add a third branch, which is evolutionary determinism, where the factors that influence our experience of place are both, but the evolutionary component is said to be the primary one. So a definition of place has to include these three components, in particular form, function, and perception. So form is the physical components, functions are the things we can do or think we could do, and perception is the thoughts, feelings, and visual stimuli when interacting with a space. And here we see that taking together place and place making nicely aligns with the definition of landscape that some of us might already be aware of. And again, we can think of place as very localized landscapes composed of land cover, land use, and landscape perception, so form, function, and perception respectively, however on a different scale and in a different system and with different reference points. So when measuring, so going to the meat of the presentation, we measured place by including these spatial indicators, which we all know, which would be form and function, that is building height or distances to services. The key here was to include the perception component, which is not widely available at this spatial or in a spatially explicit way, covering large areas or landscapes. We measured this perception indicator through an online choice experiment, which asked 10,000 people to compare 7,000 places through this kind of online experiment. And here just an example of the spatial kind of spread of the points and what the participants saw. Given enough comparisons, we can produce a full ranking as well as the score of these places. Using the urbanity perception as an example, we see here the distribution of scores, where we nicely see outliers at the top, which would be the very urban spaces, which always dominate in this comparison, and the least urban spaces. In this case, it would be rural spaces. In between, we have what I would like to call the slope of subjectivity, where the differences are much more gradual, which makes us appear in everyday life that we think that the perception is subjective. However, with good enough data, we can see that there are differences in them. And here's a network graph showing this relationship between the places. The most urban ones would be somewhere in the middle, whereas the least ones on the outside. Here we see the top performing and the least performing places, or perception, sorry. And we can also map these point data as heat maps. I would like to draw your attention to the residential and recreational maps, where we see that places where people live or perceive as livable spaces are perceived to not be suitable for recreation, which is kind of an important point if you want to engage people with the places where they live, for example, through recreational activities. So, drawing the point home, we now have the perception indicator on the same spatial resolution or in a similar way that we measure temperature or any other spatial indicator. We can do all sorts of data manipulation, in this case clustering, using 5 clusters with all place indicators. And on this slide I would like to just point out that place is not the same as perception. As we can see here, clustering on place, we find nicely the urban-rural gradient with central areas as well as suburban and peri-urban cores and natural areas, whereas the perception of places is much more heterogeneous, which makes sense because beautiful places can be both an urban area or a park. Again, I'm going to skip for the sake of time, but we can also see what drives these kind of clusterings. And we can nicely see that the very urban clusters are much more distinct than the other 3 clusters, which are more gradual. So we can talk about the peri-urban gradient. So what do we do with all this? Well, to be honest, this is just a stepping stone for further work. What we can do, and we have tested this, is we could transfer just the perception indicator, which is a very costly thing to come by. For example, by training on OpenStreetMap data, and just by using the road type and land use, we can train a model that can be transferred to a different area in Europe, which produces very similar maps. And this model performs rather well, considering that it only has these 2 indicators compared to the full model. What we can also do is we can train generative models, in this case conditional general CGAN, to produce synthetic places based on the input data. On the other hand, we can also take new images of real or imagined places and then rate them. Putting these 2 things together, we have the potential of creating this science design loop. The main point being here that place is both a design, a location, but then also for us as scientists or researchers or policymakers, an indicator. So to summarize, place is the totality of spatial indicators in combination with perception. And we posit that place as a, not only as a concept, but as an indicator, is a useful way of navigating between local processes as well as system or landscape scale processes. So on behalf of the team that was behind this work, I would like to thank you for your attention and welcome your questions.
Questions?
Thanks a lot. I have a question. How exactly do you measure the perception? So was it based on pictures? Was it based on site? And was there some kind of grading system? And how do you make sure that, like, or how do you eliminate the biases, let's say, from that?
So I think I didn't do such a great job at explaining this. But there's a set of 7,000 of these images, which were sampled from the area of Utrecht. I'm missing now the I have an overview map in the backup slides, but I'm not going to go to it. And each participant, which were recruited through a panel service company, saw 40 of these comparisons with a random. So it's random images and a random question to 8 of these indicators. So which one? So in this case, which place is better for outdoor recreational activities, walking, cycling, playing sports, etc. And then you choose. So given enough comparisons, in our case it's 10,000 comparisons for 7,000 images, you can then create this ranking which I show here. And there's many ways of doing such rankings. This is like a very standard thing. We do this in sports, or for those gamers out there, this is in kind of matching systems for gamings. There's more sophisticated ones, but we stuck to the most simple one from the 1950s to show that this is our robust way of measuring this. And this is kind of like been applied already since 2016, the first time at MIT, or even before that, 2013. Does that help? And maybe to the point you asked about biases, etc. This is a question I get asked quite a lot. The subjectivity element. What about me? How do I feel? So first of all, those are those 8 indicators. They are very global. They are very simple in a way. So how urban we can all collectively agree on what it is, what urban constitutes, which is houses, roads, and lack of nature. The finer details get missed, and the point is not to replace this, but to provide a more robust proxy to measure the landscape scale. So this is something in addition to the still existing place-based research, which we all should practice. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, I was actually asked about, like, have you looked at the backgrounds of the participants and teasing out, like those who grew up perhaps all their lives in an urban area versus those who grew up in a more rural area, if you detected any differences?
We did this in other experiments. Here, methodologically, it's not possible, because then you cannot do this, like you lose that information, because the comparisons, which sets get compared against which, is random. So we only looked at kind of that the sample is representative of the population through age, gender, and region. And also the thing is the sample from across all of the Netherlands. So not necessarily from Utrecht. It would also include people that have never seen these places, which is also a way of circumventing a bias. It's very likely that you would see an image that you have no relation to. So this is kind of this very global or very immediate reaction to a place without those symbological connotations and experiential ones.
Thank you, Michal. And we'll move on to our 3 flash talks now. First presenter is Rafael.
Thank you very much. I will share with you this part of our project, Advancing Urban Land Change Models at the intersection of land use planning and parcel scale decision making. First of all, I would like to say that urban form matters and urban change matters. We often consider that changes in the urban form and function reach the scale of blocks or the neighborhoods, and we need to consider that everything starts at the scale of the building. Simulating land use changes in urban environments is essential for assessing the effectiveness of policies, design and assessment. So we started by analyzing 12 characters that are frequently used by the modeling community in different disciplines and different works, and we determined that 5 of them are absolutely necessary for building 3D models in a level of detail 1. These are the 12 different characteristics we obtained from this literature review, and then we discovered that width, length, number of stories, footprint area, and height give information enough as for obtaining these kind of models. Then the problem is that in documents for regulating form and function at the level of the buildings, not always, we do not always find these indicators as for assembling 3D models, and we need to undertake then discretionary decisions, either from the modeler or from the decision makers. So what we did was to look at the regulations of 3 cities, Biel, Nanterre, and Rivas-Vacia Madrid, in order to find how they regulate or not each one of these 12 different characters. This dashed line represents which is the minimum information we'll need to assemble a 3D model in level of detail 1 for the environments the regulations envision for the future. And we discovered that, for example, the city of Biel do not consider many of these characters, and therefore a model will involve more discretionary decisions from the modeler or other stakeholders. Whereas in Nanterre, for example, we need to combine more than one document in order to obtain a feasible 3D model of regulations. And for example, in Rivas-Vacia Madrid, we can obtain all the information needed from just one document. These gaps represent discretionary decision modeling processes that may involve other persons and may affect, importantly, the quality of the models. This decision to complete the models may take us to different outcomes, and of course this condition the representativeness of the evaluation of effectiveness and of policy making. And finally, it's important to measure these margins to advance the simulation of urban plan regulations using 3D models. Thank you.
Since we only have 2 more flash talks, I guess we can take questions, if there is any. Okay, thank you, Rafael. And next presenter is Somaya Abolasani.
Yeah. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Somay from Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow and Landscape Research, and I'm going to shortly talk about implementing mixed-use regulation in urban land use change models. Land use changes are highly affected by government policies and zoning regulations. And zoning regulations determines the building form constraints and permitted land use type within each zone. And in these regulations, we have very important part named mixed-use regulation, that they allow the integration of various land use types within an area and even within a building. Therefore, they are really important for urban land use planning because this kind of regulation promotes sustainability and enhance the vibrant cities in the area. And therefore, the aim of this study is to show how mixed-use regulation shape land use changes. As a case study, we have Sesslerfeld in Switzerland, and here you can see the zoning for future development, including the mixed residential, low-rise residential, high-rise residential, mixed businesses. And to simulate how land use change will happen in these zones, we need to simulate 3D buildings. And this is the result of the 3D building simulation according to the regulation in zoning plan, that they determine the maximum height of building, floor area ratio, density, which are allowed within each zone. To simulate land use change influenced by mixed-use regulation, we return to the mixed-use regulation that allow the integration of various land use types. But they also offer flexibility regarding the different land use types that can take place in a building or within an area. For example, in mixed businesses, as a case study, the regulation says industrial, commercial, and institutional uses are allowed, but they don't determine any specific regulation regarding the proportion of different uses. Therefore, we can have different output from one regulation. One possible scenario is mono-use scenario, and another one is mixed-use scenario, that in mono-use scenario, all building could have one use, and in mixed-use scenario, you could have one building, residential, commercial, or industrial, or a building which is mix of all the uses, like commercial, industrial, and institutional. Therefore, every possible scenario that is a possible outcome from one regulation have their specific consequences and consideration regarding the effect on transportation, sustainability, equity, and so on. And the key takeaways are building level simulation is necessary for accurate 3D land use change models, and simulating land use changes incorporating mixed use regulations are very important and essential for policy evaluation. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. What is the standard approach to come up with these different scenarios? Because you have shown this scenario, is it just random, or do you also develop some kind of scenarios, how you mix it?
Actually, the scenarios come from the regulations, and the regulation can have different approaches. You know, in this case, we only, because of the limitation of time, we only focused on mixed businesses, that they say they give the flexibility regarding the the mono use or having the combination. But for example, in the mixed residential, the regulation says 30% of the building must be residential, and the rest could be the different kind of the uses like commercial and a small scale commercial also. So then that was the aim of the scenario was to show how different could be the outputs.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Somaya. And as the last presenter, you will have to put up with me, but it will only be for 3 minutes. Land change models as virtual labs can help us better understand the causes and consequences of land change. Urban land change models, in this respect, present an important niche within the broader land change modeling field. Oh, I forgot that. There have been many reviews, several reviews of urban land change models, particularly focusing on specific methodological aspects, but there haven't been a similar attention on the forecasts themselves. So in this study, we carried out a comprehensive systematic review of urban land change forecasts and asked to what extent they capture the prevailing geographical trends in contemporary urbanization, how reliable are they, and with what motivations, for what purposes have they been developed. We identified almost 600 forecasts. 71 of them were regional forecasts, 12 global, and the rest of them were developed for over 300 case study locations for over 70 countries. But the forecasts are concentrated in a handful of countries, particularly China, India, Iran, Turkey, and the US. Furthermore, many forecasts were developed for the largest cities in the world, and multiple forecasts for several of them. For example, Beijing in China, Tehran in Iran. In comparison, there have been much fewer forecasts developed for small and medium-sized cities, which we know that they will also play at least an equally important role in the urban transformation of our planet. For about 20% of the forecasts, no accuracy was reported. For nearly 30% of them, only kappa was reported, and as we have seen once again in the morning session, kappa is a very poor indicator of accuracy. Together, these two constitute about half of the forecasts that were published. And as recently as 2022, which is the final year in our review. For nearly half of the forecasts, no calibration validation interval was reported. For those that were reported, the forecast interval is typically several times longer than the calibration and validation interval. However, we also found that scenario analysis has been being picked up and as at least a way to partially capture the uncertainty in the forecasts. And finally, nearly half of the studies do not state any particular motivation beyond going just an accounting of different land covers and how they change. So to conclude, the urban forecasts taken together should be more representative of the geographical trends and across city sizes. They need to be more rigorously assessed. The uncertainty in them should be better articulated and more clearly communicated. And the last but not the least, they need to be used to articulate the potential impacts, implications of future urban expansion, going beyond just an accounting of change in land cover. Thank you. So at this point, I will open the floor to questions to any of the presenters, or if there is anything that any one of us would like to bring up, we can discuss.
It's a question to you directly. When you compare, did you look at spatial resolution of the different models? I guess it will make a big difference.
The spatial resolution is typically 30 meters because most of the studies use Landsat, at least the local ones. Most of the regional ones. The global ones, typically between 300 meters to a kilometer. I don't have the exact breakdown in mind, but that's the general picture. Any other questions to any of the presenters?
So the question spans a lot of what we talked both in the morning session and now about the evaluation side of things. That it's kind of, we have a tension, right, in the sense that having a single metric can be very problematic. That doesn't capture the whole picture very often. But at the same time, lacking a single metric or a very specific set of metrics that allow a more even comparison and more systematic comparison across multiple methods becomes a problem. Like, how do you assess something is valuable for publication, for usage down the road or not? So how do we navigate this tension of like trying to evaluate, set benchmarks while not reducing things to just a single metric that then people do that without not even thinking about the practical usage of it?
Is that a question to me or the audience? So, did everyone hear the question? Does anyone want to respond? You seem to be interested.
Yes, first of all, because I'm interested in answering this question, because in our case, we created data that we can't validate against any other data. And in the beginning, maybe there's like some existential angst about having to analyze data you can't validate, but then you just look at it more carefully. So that does not answer at all the question. And I think it makes it more challenging to not have to use indicators, but then the thought process that you have to go through, then I would think that produces a better result. But then I thought I have, at the end of the day, legislation, so lawmakers or planners rely on indicators for performance assessment. So then we also have to integrate relevant indicators that they might be used. And again, taking us as an example, that would make it very difficult to even try and propose an indicator for this aspect I was talking about the perception, because again, there is this subjectivity component to it, whether we like it or not.
Any other responses? And by the way, we are only talking about the 2 dimensions here. When you get to the 3 dimensions, it's a whole different thing it becomes. Any other questions?
Great presentation. Now my question is to you, for the last presenter. Could you expand on the recognition of uncertainty? What kind of uncertainty are you talking about here? I don't come from this background, but I'm just curious about it.
So yeah, there are many sources of uncertainty, right? The uncertainty could be from the data that you use, from the implicit or explicit assumptions that you built into the model. So the one that we particularly looked at was the uncertainty that gets even larger and larger as you extend the forecast horizon. It's like a cone, right? As you forecast further into the future, you'll get even less certain of the projection. And we found a lot of, again, evidence of, it's okay to forecast until the end of the century, but at least there needs to be some recognition that, that is much less certain than when you forecast 20 years into the future. And in the broader simulation literature, there is a rule of thumb that says your forecast horizon interval should be half as long as your calibration and validation interval. But that's a rule of thumb. It's not a rule by any means. But that should be something that could be used as a guidance when we think about how far into the future we should project, forecast, and acknowledge the uncertainties that come with that. Does anyone want to add?
Well, it's more to keep the conversation going. And actually, it would be more a question to Gil, who is, I don't think he's here anymore. But so who actually verifies the reference? Like when you always talk about whatever kind of assessment, and you also looked at it in your review, like who validates the reference? Like I'm a field mapping person, and I know that everything I map in the field is a gradient actually. So already that as a base, I wonder how accurate can it be, and who is dealing with these kind of questions?
Yeah. Does anyone want to respond to this? It's a really good point about the reliability of the reference data that we use. Would you like to? Philip. So I think I know how, at least one part of Gil's response would be there is uncertainty in land, those maps, right? Land cover maps. And we say when it's 80% accurate, it's good or more. But again, I mean, there are statistical issues with that level, kind of thinking as well. But leaving those aside, part of his point is when you say our forecasts are like 70% accurate, it's actually less than the accuracy of your reference map. So his argument is you need to evaluate the accuracy of your forecasts in relation to the accuracy of the reference map that you use, because it's never perfect. Is there anything that you would like to add? No, not perfectly, yes.
Just to quickly add that indeed, like, and I will say guilty as charged as well quite often, is that we should be thinking about significance of the results, like if you're saying like it's 10% off the error or something. We should be comparing to like what is the variability within the reference data itself. Because quite often what's happening, like you say, like I improved 1 or 2%, but that's just within the noise of the label data itself, especially when it's hard tasks. So that should be the criteria for explaining the significance of our results. Try to consider that. But I've started to see a little bit more discussing, people asking for that, but it's still a long way to go.
I actually have a question to Oliver. I might have missed that. What's the resolution of those simulations? The spatial resolution?
Yeah, it's 1.5 degrees.
Okay. And I might have missed this one too. So you were talking about different factors in driving the fire. Have you considered combination of factors? Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you everyone for attending the second session as well. There's a question for this one too, like in the first one, asking you about your main takeaways. If you could just go ahead and fill that out, I would really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for all the presenters, and continue hopefully enjoying the conference.